Now we're going to go to Sheila Jeffreys. So Sheila's from the UK. She's a radical lesbian feminist author and activist. And she's going to talk today for about 30 minutes, up to 30 minutes, on the social construction of gender, of sexuality, social construction of sexuality. And there'll be 15 minutes at the end for questions. So if you have questions, put them in the Q&A so they don't get lost as the chat scrolls down. If you have questions that you'd like Sheila to answer, put them in the Q&A and then we'll try to get to them. Welcome, Sheila Jeffreys.
Hello, everybody. Yes, so today I'm going to talk about the importance of understanding social construction. The feminist campaign against the intrusion of men with female gender identities into the category of women is based on our understanding of social construction. We know that what these men call gender and see as innate consists of socially constructed sex stereotypes of what women are and how women should behave. The idea of social construction then is vital to what we do and was a vital founding understanding of the feminist movement in the 1970s and beyond. It's a puzzle to find that the understanding of social construction within our new and emerging movement does not always extend to gender in relation to some lesbians calling themselves butch, for instance, or to sexuality. There has been a profound move back to biological explanations of human sexual behavior in the last couple of decades. I'll give an example to show how powerful and how much of a problem this backwards move is. There are many lesbians today who cannot allow it to be said that women can choose to be lesbians. They are entirely under the thrall of biology. Under an interview with me in the online newspaper Lesbian and Gay News about my autobiography Trigger Warning, a commenter is angry that I used the term became a lesbian. She says that surely we all agree now that to say such a thing is homophobic. In other words, lesbians are born, not made. Where does that leave me and all the lesbians I know like me who did become lesbians or choose lesbianism after having encounters with men? We are apparently imposters, or must call ourselves bisexual, though we have had no interest in men for many, many decades, in my case, more than 40 years. The word lesbian, they say, is taken. The corollary to saying that lesbianism is innate is to say that heterosexuality is innate too. To say that previously heterosexual women cannot become lesbians is completely untrue. Back at the time of the WLM, many, many thousands of women abandoned heterosexuality completely and chose to become lesbians. This was revolutionary, I think the most revolutionary aspect of the women's liberation movement. But according to many opinions expressed even among some feminists now, this is not possible. Or even if some women choose to become lesbians, they will never be real ones, because the real ones are biological. So we can only be a pale imitation. What is even more disturbing is that there are some lesbians, some of them feminists, who argue that real lesbians are naturally something called butch, and this is biological too. Biology has come back in relation to lesbianism, but the other way that it is coming back is in the arguments that transvestites and other varieties of male fetishes use to justify their sexual practice. These days, male proponents of all kinds of fetishistic and abusive behavior appeal to biology. They say they are picked by God or some such ineluctable force to be pedophiles or nappy fetishists, and they should be tolerated or even welcomed by society because they cannot help themselves and are just part of the fascinating diversity of biological sexual minorities. And they are gaining considerable success. Feminist theory developed from ideas of social construction, and it isn't possible without them. The way that the masses were kept down historically was to say that their oppression was natural, if not biological. This was taught through religion. It's clearly expressed in the Christian hymn, All Things Bright and Beautiful, which has the line, "The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate. God made them high or lowly, he ordered their estate." When the church was no longer so effective as controlling the people, into its place stepped the sexologists and evolutionary biologists and various male scientists, who stated that the power relations between races and sexes were natural and biological. Male scientists sought to prove that Black people were less intelligent than white people, for instance. One of these was Hans Eysenck, who was at King's College in London. He stated in a 1971 book, "All the evidence to date suggests the overwhelming importance of genetic factors in producing the great variety of intellectual differences which we observe in our culture, and much of the difference observed between certain racial groups." Other male scientists said that women had different kinds of brains from men that made them good at things like monotonous work in factories, for instance. In contrast to this harmful biologism that has always come from scientists and the medical profession, in the middle of the 20th century, there was a revolution in thinking about human behavior, which powered the social justice movements of the 1960s, including feminism. This consisted of the creation of the social sciences of anthropology and sociology, which argued that human behavior was not natural at all, but socially and politically constructed. They argued that sexuality was constructed too. Anthropologists like Margaret Mead in her book, Starting with Coming of Age in Samoa in 1928, and Cleland Ford and Frank Beach in their book, Patterns of Sexual Behavior in 1951, said that their research proved that what was understood as sex and what was seen as acceptable and unacceptable in sex varied hugely across different cultures. Sex was, they said, constructed in and through culture. Two sociologists, John Gagnon and William Simon, developed what was called sexual script theory in a book in 1973, which argued that sex took place according to a script, which was created by the society in which people lived. These men were not pro-feminists. They didn't notice or comment upon the fact that sex is constructed fundamentally within the power relations of male domination and female subordination. They left the manner of construction a mystery. These ideas, however, created a revolution. The idea that race as a concept in which there were naturally different habits and abilities between Black and white people, that was just an invention to secure the power of slave owners, was vital to the civil rights movement. Similarly, the understanding that sex stereotypes, what are now called gender, were socially constructed, was fundamental to the development of the women's liberation movement. That which was socially constructed could be changed, and that allowed the possibility of revolution. There was an explosion of research and activism against socially imposed sex stereotypes in the 1970s. This was a strong movement, and that is why it's such a shock to us veteran feminists in particular to see that all the old ideas about gender came back in a new form with men who are sexually excited by the subordination that they represent, who reinvented the idea of natural gender and demanded the transgendering of children who play with the wrong toys. Radical feminists oppose any notion that women are naturally feminine and men are naturally masculine. Rather, we argue that femininity is the behavior of subordination and masculinity is the behavior of domination, and these are learned. To give one example, the ways in which men and women use space and hold their bodies, quite apart from what they may wear, how they may speak, and what they may do, is entirely constructed. Little girls are trained to not take up space. They should sit with knees together and not sprawl. Girls must not look directly at men, but have downcast eyes. They should be careful not to touch men, lest they be seen as provocative. They should not be sporty or climb trees, and anyway, that's quite hard in skirts. Boys must do the opposite of all the above. They are trained to man spread. keep their knees apart, engage in the behaviors of power, staring at women, touching women, and harassing women. These behaviors are not natural, but the taught behaviors that represent power relations. Transvestites have many sites on the internet where they can watch videos and train themselves to sit and walk and talk like women, behavior which does not come naturally to them any more than it does to women. We see, as radical feminists, any performance of the genders of power or powerlessness as a problem. But some lesbians, even some who are feminists, refer to themselves as butch today and see butchness as representing some kind of innate lesbianism. This shows the very low ebb in lesbian feminist politics in the present, when there is so little lesbian visibility and lesbian pride that going back to these old forms from the 1950s seems to be the only way that many lesbians can think about who they are. The fact that the rejection of gender, or what we called sex role stereotypes, was so vital to the very possibility of a feminist movement is why many of us old lesbian feminists were horrified to see a rebirth of lesbian butch femme role-playing. In the 1970s, both gay men involved in the gay liberation movement, as well as lesbians involved in the women's liberation movement, entirely rejected what we called sex roles. They were seen as part of our oppression, and imitating the oppressive structures of heterosexual domination and submission that we were fighting our way out of. But there was a backlash against all these ideas. Today, the way in which these revolutionary movements challenged role-playing is long forgotten. There is a cult of role-playing in the US, and in recent years, there have been regular conferences there for femmes, which are very much about the sex industry, and which transvestites attend, pretending to be femme lesbians, and for butches, which valorize masculinity, calling some lesbians masculine of center, whatever that means. One result of the movement back to role-playing is that many lesbians today call themselves butches, and they say this is nothing to do with men and male power. How dare we suggest such a thing, they say. But of course, butch is part of a binary, and the other half of the binary is femme. Butches can't exist all on their own. This binary represents the power relations of heterosexuality and male domination. Today, butch is often promoted as just a word for real lesbians. Who knows where the femmes have gone? There are butch magazines and fashion shows and photo albums. They're all just lesbians, but give themselves this powerful, because it means masculinity, name. The lesbians who call themselves butch look exactly like the lesbian feminists in the 1970s and 80s. But at the time, we saw the word butch as an insult. We wanted nothing to do with men. That is an important reason why we were lesbians. We were women exercising our freedom, throwing off femininity, and having a revolution. I can remember being shocked in the late 1970s at finding that some heterosexual feminists called us lesbians in Leeds, UK, butch, because we had short hair and wore waistcoats. We were horrified. The way the notion of butch has not just returns, but claims to represent lesbianism and dominates areas of lesbian culture is very disturbing. It serves to divide lesbians. And we cannot have a lesbian or feminist revolution if we are divided among ourselves. Instead of all lesbians working together and seeing themselves as having a common cause, lesbians are divided into real ones and imitations, the powerful and the powerless. The butch lesbians are divided from the older generation of lesbians who rejected role-playing, and so on. It is important to understand why the notion of butch has an appeal now that it did not a while back. I suspect it is because the pornification of culture makes womanhood less and less desirable for women who want to be proud and free. Lesbianism is an expression of free womanhood, and is particularly despised and suppressed right now. There is no lesbian infrastructure to support women having a strong lesbian identity that does not hark back to the anti-lesbian idea that we must somehow be masculine just because we refuse to do the behavior of subordination that is femininity. This might explain why some lesbians have adopted an identity that seems to offer self-respect. But if we accept that masculinity and femininity are socially constructed behaviors that represent the statuses of up and down in a hierarchy, then the notion of butchness needs to be questioned, just as much as any other forms of sex stereotyping or gender do. I now want to talk about the way that sexuality generally is constructed out of the relations of male domination. The sex of male domination, it takes the form of eroticizing women's subordination and men's domination. The sexologists, sex therapists, and pornographers who construct sex in the present define sex as penis in vagina sexual intercourse. This practice symbolizes the power relations of male domination. It's an activity in which the organ which signifies a man's membership of the male sex caste is used to penetrate the genitals that signify a woman's membership of the subordinate sex caste. It's the activity which builds and maintains a man's sense of his status and woman's sense of her subordinate status. Sexual behavior is not natural, but heavily and determinedly politically constructed. Where once it was constructed by religion, it's now constructed by two very powerful and influential authorities: sexology, the science of sex and its practical offshoot, sex therapy, and the sex industry, mainly pornography, which is the main, if not only, sex education tool of generations of boys in the present. The act of penis in vagina sex itself is learnt. There is a great example of this in the sexological literature, of a couple coming to see a doctor because the woman was not getting pregnant. The problem was that the man was penetrating the woman's belly button. He knew he had to penetrate something, but he had no idea what. That problem would not arise today. Boys and men consume a relentless diet of women being penetrated with penises every which way. They know what they are supposed to do. The founding fathers of sexology prescribed what men should do and how women should react. In the early 20th century, the British sexologist Henry Havelock Ellis explained that sex must take place in the form of man on top and woman on the bottom, penis in vagina sexual intercourse. The man should be active and the woman passive. Her body the violin, he said, and his hand the bow. He said that men naturally like to play the role of hunter. He did not believe in rape and thought women lied about it. Women were naturally masochistic, he said. The proof was that a woman's face, when she has an orgasm, is just like the rictus of pain when a woman's clitoris is cut off by a doctor to stop her masturbating, something which was done quite a bit at that time. Penis in vagina sexual intercourse is a practice that is very problematic for women, so it does need to be imposed with considerable force and pressure. It's not well related to women's sexual pleasure. It requires the technologization of women's bodies to prevent pregnancy. It carries the risk of sexually transmitted diseases, and it symbolizes dominant submissive relations. It is often very painful, particularly after menopause, when women have to anoint themselves with lubricants to allow access. It's the only sexual activity which impregnates women. But because of its symbolic and actual advantages, to men, it remains what is seen as sex. If it were not enforced upon women as strongly as it is, it does seem likely that much less of it would happen. And I would like to see that happen as a social experiment. I think that would be quite interesting. Now, the construction of women's sexuality is generally around masochism. Women's sexual feelings are not natural, but they are socially constructed. Many women experience masochistic fantasies, i.e., they eroticize their own subordination. This is not natural. Women eroticize their own subordination because in heterosexuality they have nothing else to eroticize. They do not have equality to eroticize or power to eroticize. They do not usually have much chance to work out their own sexuality because they will experience male sexual coercion from childhood onwards, even if they escape actually being raped. Men, on the other hand, eroticize domination. This is clear from their pornography, which mostly involves forms of violence, cruelty, and humiliation towards women, and trains men to see this as just what sex is. The pornography of today goes a great deal further than the sexologists of yesteryear were prepared to go in the extremes of abuse towards women. Sex therapy uses pornography to teach women what to do and normalizes men's sexual violent practices. Teen Vogue teaches girl children how to do anal sex, not because it is anything to do with girls' pleasure. In fact, girls find it painful, but because men want to do this, and so much of porn includes it as the way for men to be men. Women's Health magazine, like so many popular women's magazines today, has an article on how choking, a practice used in 1/4 of all killings of women in the UK, can be fun. The objective of feminism has to be the eroticizing of equality. That, as I always say when talking of this, sounds about as sexy to many as a cold rice pudding. That's because the whole culture in pornified, male-dominated societies is geared to finding only violations of consent and the operation of power exciting. There can be no success for feminism while sex continues to take the form of the eroticizing of women's subordination. We need to change this. Some will say, but surely we can't change our sexual fantasies. They are just who we are. Not so, of course. We can be furious that the power relations of male domination have entered our heads and affected something that seems so personal. And that fury can enable us to change the sexual contents of our heads. There's nothing inevitable about it. Back in the early 80s, when sadomasochism was being propelled into the lesbian community here in the UK from its origins in the US, some of us would conduct workshops at conferences on how to change sexual fantasies. We would talk about ridiculous fantasies and roar with laughter at them. Laughter is a good disinfectant. Laughter and sadomasochism really do not mix well. Sexual fantasies can certainly be changed or abandoned altogether as undermining and unhelpful. I now want to look at the question of whether heterosexuality and homosexuality are biologically or socially constructed. The sexologists, the scientists of sex, are still heavily invested in biological explanations for sexual behavior. They say, of course, that sexual orientation is biological. They carry out research desperately trying to find the gene or area of the brain that causes people to be lesbian or gay. The research is based on the idea that heterosexuality is natural and that they, the scientists, will be able to find some deviation, some fault that can cause people to be abnormal. Their work has been roundly debunked. There are no biological markers that have been found for sexual behavior. They don't look for the causes of heterosexuality because that's natural. They look for what must have gone wrong. Their zeal is religious, and they will brook no arguments against biology, though their theories are more and more wild and they can find nothing to back them up. The less evidence there is, the wilder they become. The gay sexologist James Cantor thinks that homosexuality is a biological mistake. He says that the idea that men are essentially born gay or straight is now pretty much taken for granted. Not so in feminism. His mentor was Ray Blanchard, who has said sensible things to say about transvestism. Blanchard, however, apparently figured out that homosexuality in men follows from interactions before birth between male fetuses and the immune system of the mother. And it happens particularly where the man has a number of older brothers, because the greater number of male fetuses has a greater effect on the mother's immune system. Of course, none of this works for lesbians, and of course, they never do research on lesbians. James Cantor and Ray Blanchard have decided that paedophilia is the result of faulty biology too. Cantor says that paedophiles show important differences from non-paedophiles, and so paedophilia is an innate and probably immutable feature. People, he says, do not choose to be sexually attracted to children. Actually, women don't choose to be sexually attracted to children and do not abuse them. It is these men who have ordained that heterosexuality is innate and that homosexuality is a biological mistake. Feminists, though, have never subscribed to these increasingly bizarre ideas. We say that heterosexuality itself is a social construction. The sexologists never sought an explanation for lesbianism. And lesbians have always been a thorn in the side for these scientists because they don't fit into any of their theories or any of their research. Lesbian feminists argue that heterosexuality is an institution rather than a sexual preference. Saying that it is an institution means that it goes far beyond just an attraction to persons of the opposite sex, but it's socially and politically constructed to provide a means of extracting women's unpaid labor and controlling women under the power of individual men and families. Male domination is founded upon the possession of use of women's bodies in relationships, which in most part of the world and most of history were forced upon girls and women. Heterosexuality is necessary to male domination because it's the foundation of men's power, and women are indentured into it as children in child marriage, more reasonably called child sexual slavery, or bought, sold, and exchanged in the West. Only in forced marriage and polygamy. Only in certain cultures in the West can women be said to choose to enter heterosexuality. The forms of unpaid labor that men acquire are sexual servicing, in which women are used routinely in sex they do not want but cannot say no to, domestic labor, emotional labor, the production and rearing of children. All of this is free. This unpaid labor is the basis of the global economy, which could not survive without it. It's an affirmative action program for men, which is essential to their rule. It is a slave system because women earn nothing except the destruction of their opportunities. This is such a necessary foundation for the whole economic and political system of male domination that it cannot be left to chance or choice. For all these reasons, heterosexuality is, as the lesbian feminist theorist Adrienne Rich said, compulsory. The forces that propel women into heterosexuality include the heterosexualization of the entire culture, pressure from within families, the insistent pressure of boys and men from childhood, which requires girls and women to be sexually available, rape and other forms of sexual violence, the erasure of lesbians from culture taking place now through the transgendering of lesbians, and the exclusion of use of the lesbian word. One of the pressures comes from those within the lesbian community now, who seek to disown and exclude women like me and other feminists, who say it's possible to choose to be lesbians. Forces include the absence of any lesbian infrastructure to support girls and women becoming lesbians within their schools or wider society. There's little or no lesbian literature, theatre, films, TV series. There are no longer, as once there were, lesbian centres, bars and clubs. There are no lesbian groups that do not have transvestites in them, trying to get sexual access to lesbians. There is no infrastructure at all. We made our own in the 70s and 80s, and it was grand, but it's all been dismantled and demolished. Nobody today could become a lesbian just because they saw a lesbian universe that was so attractive they just plunged in, as many of us did at one time. Even the dating apps are dominated by transvestites. But lesbianism has huge advantages, which suggests that great forces of power are required to force women into heterosexuality. After all, relating to someone with the same body is likely to be more sexually satisfying. There is unlikely to be coercion into unwanted sex in which women lie there being used while thinking of the next day's housework. Childcare and housework are likely to be shared, and there is research to show this. There is no need for protection against unwanted pregnancy or most sexually transmitted diseases because they come from the penis. There is much less chance of violence and abuse. There is much greater chance of having interests in common and a close companionship with someone who is not trained from birth to have different and conflicting interests. Research suggests that men who marry or live in heterosexual relationships are healthier, happier, and live longer than those who do not. The opposite is the case for women. So this is a very attractive picture of lesbianism, and there has to be the exercise of considerable force to ensure that women do not choose to be lesbians. The analysis of heterosexuality as compulsory and as a political institution was created by lesbian feminists in the 1970s and 80s. Most of whom had made a political and personal choice to be lesbians. It was a personal choice because it was about the pursuit of happiness. It was a political choice because we considered that women who withdrew from men to put all their energies into each other, the solution, rather than men, the problem, would be much better able to work for the overthrow of male domination. We would be putting all our energies into women and into the revolution. We hoped to undermine the institution of heterosexuality. This was a hugely revolutionary development. With the women who had been lesbians all along, we created a culture and community that was very exciting and an instrument of change. This has been swept away in a massive anti-feminist and anti-lesbian backlash. Part of that backlash is the fury of some mostly younger lesbians today at the very idea of political lesbianism. They see it as homophobic to say that lesbian is not innate, biological, and fixed at birth. But this idea and the anti-feminist and anti-lesbian politics that it represents are the product of a particular stage in history. Women's ideas about what lesbianism is and how they became lesbians change according to wider historical forces. A student of mine, Loreen Gottschalk, researched what women in 3 different cohorts thought about the origins of their lesbianism. Women who came out as lesbians in the 1970s mostly said they chose to be lesbians. Women who came out in the 1980s were equally balanced between those who said they chose and those who thought it was biology. Women who came out in the 1990s mostly thought it was biology. Women think about themselves and what they do in the language and concepts available to them at the time. Now we are in a very biologistic time, where even talking of becoming a lesbian is seen by some as heresy. In order to create a strong and effective lesbian and feminist revolution, we need to be consistent in our understanding of how sex stereotyping or gender, whether that of lesbian role-playing or in heterosexuality, is constructed, and how sexuality is constructed too. Arguments as to innateness and biology are designed to prevent criticism, prevent the developments of ideas, and prevent revolutionary change. Thank you. Jess Williams says, in the last seminar, the webinar she saw me on, I talked about the history of gender identity and that the men that needed to make people see them differently connected it with children to make it seem less devious. Yes, that's absolutely right. It's the adult transgenders who have campaigned to transgender children. There's no question whatsoever. Children didn't do it themselves. It's the adult men who campaigned to transgender children because they wanted to make it look as if it wasn't a sexual fetish, which in fact it is. So they are responsible for that. As Helen says, are we actually moving from biological essentialism that anti-feminists use to gendered essentialism that states we can define gender with gender expressions? I see them as very similar, and really, I'm not sure about the difference there. Sheila, do you think, this is Denise McKenna, that one very important thing women should be fighting for is the history of feminism be taught on a compulsory basis in schools? That would be lovely, but which version of the history of feminism is going to be taught? That is the question, I think. But yes, of course, there should be feminism being taught in schools. I think there was, when I was in Australia, there was once a sort of end of school qualification. One of the subjects was feminism. They got rid of that a few years ago. Christina says, if you could choose to include 3 topics in sex ed for teenagers, which topics and which books? All I can say in shortened form is that what children need to be taught is, first of all, they may or may not wish to be sexual. Only if they decide that they wish to be sexual, do they have to choose whether they want to be sexual simply with themselves, which is in the form of self-stimulation, or they wish to be sexual with other persons. They, of course, have none of these choices and they're not taught any of them. If they wish to be sexual with other persons, would they like to choose persons of the same or the opposite sex? All of the advantages of lesbianism at this point need to be taught very, very clearly. You can imagine this. And even the clitoris might need to be taught. That would be good. And then should they actually choose men, even though lesbianism is so obviously a superior choice, particularly at this stage in history, then they might need to choose which particular sexual practice they would wish to engage in. There is no choice, of course. They will be expected to do penis in vagina sexual intercourse. If they are forced to, or they do choose penis in vagina sexual intercourse, then there should be a choice as to whether they are going to contracept or not. There is no choice about that most of the time, of course, in most countries in the world. If they are able to, if the contraception fails, then they're in a position as having to decide whether or not they need an abortion. I always say all of this, and I used to teach it to my students, because people talk about abortion as if this was something straightforward. Women can choose abortion. Abortion is the end of a process in which women and girls have had no choices in anything whatsoever at all. Choice would be really nice, but the idea of teaching that, I mean, it's kind of extraordinary. That's not going to happen. Then somebody who's anonymous says, Sheila, what is your opinion on the idea that all humans are potentially bisexual? the potential to be attracted to either sex. Yes, I guess I do think that. I do not think that at the moment this is helpful, because actually we're in a situation where heterosexuality is totally enforced and lesbianism is the really sensible, revolutionary and practical solution at this time in terms of women's happiness and women's possibilities. It's vaguely possible to imagine a different world, but I don't think we're going to see it in hundreds of years. So I don't think we need to even think about that possibility, because that's not going to happen soon. Jess Williams says, and how do you think we can talk about political lesbianism more in gender critical and radfem spaces without it going badly? I don't know, because I get an enormous amount of backlash, as you know, for the sort of things that I say, being told that I'm not really a lesbian, not a real one, I'm a bisexual, etc., etc. Having women lying on the floor where I give talks calling me a CUNT and shouting that I'm not a lesbian. I have all of that. And so, yes, but that shows the backlash and the shit that you get for talking about these things shows how crucially important it is. We're talking about something absolutely fundamental here, or there would not be so much strife.